Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It is exactly 9 o'clock. And I'd like to remind you that this hour is brought to you by African Muslims agencies. And in this hour as well, we will be taking a listen to the Fired Up series with Hafiz Imran Chunara, who is a personal excellence mentor and CEO of Africa Muslims Agency. So we will be taking a listen to that in a few minutes' time. So once again, welcome to the second hour of the show, News and Views on Salam Media, brought to you by Africa Muslims Agency. We now cross over to the Western Cape, and we are going to be talking with convener of Save Our Sacred Lands, and we're looking at a very, very controversial issue in the Western Cape, and it has to do with the end to Hell Run. That is what it is. It has been named as. The city of Cape Town faces community backlash over the proposed 180 million rands wall on the N2 Hell Run. And of course, they're planning to build this wall along the section of the N2 highway near Cape Town International Airport. This has drawn opposition, with critics citing a lack of consultation and arguing that the city should rather fund more programs to address the root causes of crime. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the program, Tauriq Jenkins.
Walaikum salam, and thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you. What's your take as convener of Save Our Sacred Lands on this matter?
Well, on this particular matter, what we're really talking about here is how power uses space to decide whose dignity matters. And from a human rights dignity perspective, we're very clear in this country around constitutional rights and issues around spatial violence. And our South African Constitution guarantees dignity, equality, and freedom of movement. But those rights don't only get violated by laws, they also get violated by the ongoing legacy of apartheid spatial plans. So in this case, when infrastructure is built to protect some people, and if you take a look at the history of the N2 and how the N2 in many ways is, it is an historical management of apartheid spatial planning, designed really to protect some people from sight and also to monitor and negotiate the proximity of others. And in this case, on either side of the N2, as you get off Cape Town International Airport, what you will witness is really the failing of the city's ability to address meaningfully over the last, a decade or so, even longer, systemic issues of poverty and violence. And so in this case, you have a situation where dignity doesn't end at the edge of a highway. And in our view, it's this sort of thinking of an architecture of control, which is also similar in terms of how we measure what happens in the occupied territories in Palestine. And I think this comparison is completely unavoidable. In the West Bank, walls of segregated roads are in a way, they're justified in the same language that we're doing now. It's all about sort of security, safety, and protecting motorists. But, in this case, we don't just separate land. We separate the lives of those who are also allowed to move freely.
So, Tauriq, there have been very many incidents reported about violence along that stretch of road. I mean, it's actually been dubbed as the Hell Run, stone throwing being one of the very big issues there. Apparently, a number of people were killed due to stone throwing en route or back from the airport. Those families that have lost loved ones in that way wouldn't necessarily agree with you about the apartheid wall. In your view, how do you believe then the matter should be addressed? And if that amount of money, we're talking a large amount of money, 180 million rands, how could it be put to better use rather than erecting a wall? And do you think that it could start rehabilitating that part of Cape Town, perhaps educating and whatever else needs to be put in place for that type of criminal activity to be stopped?
Look, I think the issue here is that um, the more historical systemic aspects about what causes violence in these communities, um, where
Sure.
is poverty located, and that the outflow of some of those violences that that motorists do experience are part of this manifestation of the fault lines of apartheid, and the extent to which we need to address um, those kinds of deeper societal aspects. So instead of spending 120 million rand in building a wall, which in my view is both cosmetic and in terms of how it actually invisibilizes a particular, not just invisibilizes what happens to indigenous bodies that are on the receiving end of the toxic residues of apartheid spatial planning, but also it 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 shuns off what is a clear responsibility, by our government and by the city in terms of dealing with these things. And I think there are a number of other uses that can be made with the 120 million, apart from building concrete on either side, such as the kinds of, emergency crisis um, alleviation processes that can be considered within, medical healthcare, within the schooling, as you say, educational aspects, and forms of dealing with, with the issues of dignity around to basic needs. And I think that this thinking that it's fine to 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 impose this kind of spatial harm, because I mean the right of freedom to movement isn't only about crossing a wall, crossing a border. It's about whether your daily life is made harder and more
Mm.
dangerous by design. And walls and barriers redirect pedestrians into unsafe routes. Communities already living next to the highway absorb pollution, noise, risk, and then also policing, often without protection. So the burden of safety is again hoisted back onto the onto the poor. And I think if you be honest, the communities along the N2 corridor are not just informal settlements. They sit on land shaped by centuries of a history of indigenous dispossession. Uh, initially starting from the San and Khoi, and then followed by apartheid forced removals and these buffer zones. So apartheid didn't disappear; it has left its residues, and those residues are spatial. And when you live in a city where the current mayor has kind of dismissed the term apartheid spatial planning as some kind of propaganda, I think this does give us an indication of of the sort of thinking which is not based on a progressive form of a structural analysis in terms of how to alleviate these conditions that are so dire in these communities. But it's really about how the indignity of someone who has the privilege of being in a motor vehicle, or tourists that are coming into Cape Town who are kind of introduced into the landscape in a way which might not be ideal for for the city. And I think there are other kinds of certainly a whole range of other ways around which we can avoid this idea of how walls really become a very serious repeat of aspects of of imperial thinking, of apartheid and colonial framing, in ways that really center the communities that are impacted first and foremost, and not sort of other sort of other aspects of of the city, which the city, as we know in terms of how they operate, tend to prioritize, your taxpayers and so on. Yeah.
Sure, we're going to have to leave it there, but one final important question. Are you engaging with the city of Cape Town regarding this matter? And I agree with you 101%. That wall is going to create more distrust and more enmity amongst the people, because they are going to be asking the questions. I don't think there weren't any consultations with the people, and clearly that money could be put to better use. So have you and other like-minded groups have had talks with the city of Cape Town? Where do we stand right now on this matter?
I think how you've articulated it really is the burning issue. The fact that 120 million rand is now being allocated, and by the way, it goes up to about 180.
That's right.
It's been allocated, and it's been allocated unilaterally. And I think it's the combination of the fact that the city's coffers have or the process around how money is being used by the city, especially this amount and in this particular kind of way, without due public participatory process in terms of the initial co-design and so on. I mean, who comes up with this idea in the first place? And I think it's absolutely important for us to remain vigilant and to push the city in terms of answering certain questions, and exactly the question as that you pointed out around public participation. So that there will be a budget. There are some processes around how budgets eventually are stamped, but how we experience the city's budget is really a tick box exercise where these kinds of fiscal arrangements are kind of made by a few people, often in conjunction with planners, with the construction industry and developers and so forth. But the extent to which the communities that were impacted, the extent to which they were part of the initial inception of the set of plans, and the extent to which they have a degree of agency around having rates and taxpayers' money basically used to put up walls which are very symptomatic of a particular kind of political dispensation that we're in, where the hardened right has become galvanized, and in some ways this articulation of the war is also signaling a particular kind of political allegiance. We hear of Trump's obsession with the Mexican wall and how Mexico would pay for it, and with it comes all these xenophobic, Afrophobic aspects and resonances. And I think that part of that, you see this kind of political gesturing that is moving towards towards the right, whether it's apartheid denial, genocidal denial, by the DA, and other aspects around, for example, not being clear enough on the whole trope of Afrikaner refugees that are claiming status as being victims of a white genocide. And when you take a look at all these things together, where Afrikaner refugees can have status of a white genocide, but we're talking about areas on either side of the N2 that are literally, a sort of a Western Cape Townian form of apartheid spatially planned that are akin to Gaza, and how we as countries also share this particular kind of legacies around spatial planning and spatial apartheid. And that's why public participatory aspects in our democracy are so absolutely important, because in 2026,
unfortunately, Tauriq, I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry. Our next guest has connected, but we will have to leave it there. But thank you indeed for your input on this matter. Thank you so much for talking to us. Till the next time, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you for having me.
It is exactly 9:15 a.m. We will be taking a short break, and then we'll be joined by Shaheen Isup, who is a board member of SAHUK, and we're going to get an update on the current 2026 Hajj preparations, or rather the final preparations for the Nusuk Hajj.